Hello, friend. I'm going to ask you to bear with me today because I'm going to talk about something that has been a struggle for me throughout my faith journey when I'm reading the text. And those of you that may know me understand that I've got the concentration of a gnat. Some people might call it ADHD, but I'm like a squirrel on a hot summer day that's lost all of its nuts. I bounce everywhere. And when I come to reading the stories of the Bible, it's often hard for me to focus. I grew up in the church. I attended a Bible college. All my life, I've heard these stories of the text. And it's difficult for me sometimes to sit down and read this and get interested in it. I've read it before. I've read it cover to cover a few times, many times, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sermons, and it becomes boring. It becomes old. And I want us to just think about this. And I want to talk about this because when we can look at the text like it's new, our excitement builds again. And it's something interesting I came across. It's something that Rabbi David Foreman talks about, but he calls it the lullaby effect. And the lullaby effect is where we've heard something so often, so frequently, that we don't even understand what we're actually hearing. And I could say a couple phrases, like if I would say, life is like a box of, you're immediately going to finish that sentence, or like a good neighbor. Like we know this, we've heard it so many times. And when we hear about lullabies or the lullaby effect, it starts to make sense. So something like rockabye baby in the treetops, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. And it's this lovely little lullaby. You picture this mother holding her infant, rocking it back and forth, singing this song to her. But if you actually hear it, if you understand what it's saying, it's talking about that the bow's going to break, the baby's going to fall down and die. And there's a few different meanings of this lullaby. Some people think it's of infant mortality. Other people think it's because the king's descendants were being threatened by the actual Protestants and the threat of life. But that lullaby is something that we probably shouldn't sing to little babies about babies dying. But when we pick up the text, often we do the same thing. Often we know the story so well that we just read through it and it doesn't get past that peripheral reading or that simple reading in our minds. So when we read these stories, we want to dive into them at a deeper level. We want to try to figure out a way that when we start reading these stories that it becomes alive, and we have to break through and break that lens or that lullaby that we have in our minds. So I come from it like I've heard these stories so many times, I could tell you these stories. So it's hard for me to get something new out of it. Where if you're coming into it new, you may have preconceived ideas of what it says. You see a word or something that really jumps out to you and it flavors or colors your understanding of it. And that's what happens a lot, is our preconceived ideas enter into the story, and then it's harder for us to open it up and understand it for ourselves. We get this in archaeology. So as a believer, and you'll see this on YouTube a lot, you'll see these Christians that have found a new discovery, or they found the real whatever. And what happens is when you know the story, you go to archaeology and say, well, the story says this, this, and this, therefore I found these three things that are similar, therefore that has to be the same thing. And one of the ones that shows up in Jerusalem is they found an ossuary, which an ossuary is a bone box. A bone box is where after someone has died, a year later, you gather up their bones and you put it into a bone box. It's only about yay big. The longest bone would fit in all the other bones. And they found one around Jerusalem that on it said James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. And immediately it blew up in the archaeological world going, is this truly the brother of Jesus? There was major court cases. Some people thought it was a forgery. It has been just this back and forth between the faith groups, archaeological groups, and all of this. And the conclusion was, yes, it is a first century bone box. The problem is the names James, Joseph, and Jesus are extremely prevalent at that time. So it's very, very hard to say 100% that is definitely the brother of Jesus. Could it be? Absolutely. But it's easy for us to say, well, we know that James is the brother of Jesus, the son of Joseph. Therefore, anytime we see those three names together, it's got to be right. Well, when we read the text, we have these preconceived ideas, and we often put our influence inside this text and it flavors it. So what we want to do is we want to try to read these stories as if we're reading it for the very first time. And to do that, one thing that I have been trying to do is I write down my preconceived ideas. So if I'm doing this story of David and Goliath, what are my assumptions? Just write 3 or 4 of my main points of going, oh, this, and this are the main things that I think this story says. Put that aside and say, okay, let me read this completely anew and see what I can get out of this new reading. One of the key ways that I've personally been able to get these stories to come alive is physically walking the lands of the Bible. And I know that not everybody's going to be able to do that, but God has blessed me to be able to walk a lot of these stories. And what I find interesting is when I disconnect from the written word as much and not focusing on that as much and dealing with the physical world, all of my senses start to understand the narrative better. So I can understand how physically difficult this journey was from this point to this point. I understand the terrain, the smells, the sights, all of that. So it allows me to connect with that story a little bit easier. When my senses are involved, then the story becomes alive. So now when I open this up and read the story of David and Goliath, for example, I've walked that trail. I've left Bethlehem, hiked the 26 miles through the different valleys and out to the Valley of Elah. I can put myself there in his shoes. When I start doing that, I can read this story, and I have different colors now and different lenses to be able to look through it. And in this, I think Proverbs it might be 20, but I forget now. But it talks about that God gives us eyes to see and ears to hear him. And when we pick up the Bible, when we pick up the text, that prayer is something that we can pray and say, God, please give me eyes to see and ears to hear your words. Because he opens the eyes, he gives us the ears to hear. And when that happens, these stories that we've read, may know them really well, or maybe the very first time, they will come alive like you've never read before. Thank you so much for watching.